Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We have got a great one for you today. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome onto the stage here, as you're already seeing, two of my favorite people that we go back with for years and have been doing great work for the United States and our country, and just wonderful people. We have Danielle Bryant, the executive director for the program on government oversight, and of course, show favorites, Matthew Ho at the Eisenhower Media Group. And so we are so grateful to have you guys on. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive.
Hi, Danny.
So listen, we'll just jump right into this because we have something I know is near and dear to all of our hearts today, and that is on the some issues related to the military industrial complex. A lot of people hear that, they hear Mick, and maybe they've even heard that the Eisenhower made some famous comment on his final speech as president in his address, but they may not really know exactly what he actually said. And there's a part of this speech that we're going to show just a small portion of it here that doesn't get talked about very often, but is going to play a central role in our conversation here. Gary, roll that.
We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
Only a well-informed citizenry can force can prevent this kind of usurpation of our own American power. And he's talking about right there at the beginning. This whole military-industrial complex can have unwarranted power and influence that could actually take over what the citizenry would otherwise do. Now,
I've never seen him actually say it before, so that was pretty cool.
It really is. I wish we could play the whole thing and encourage people to just Google that online because it's worth watching. But that was 1961. What about today? Here's how some of our okay. And actually, let me set this up a little bit to compare. You had Eisenhower, former 5-star general, one of the most accomplished military leaders of our generation, seeking for peace, which he did in a previous, in actually his first speech in 1953, and in this one, warning about the dangers of the military-industrial complex taking over policy. So your best warrior is also looking for peace. Let's see how that matches up with today, and let's look at our Secretary of State first.
Virtually all of the security assistance that we've provided Ukraine, that gets invested right here in the United States. That's where it's spent. So in many ways, this is a win-win for us.
So we've gone from warning about the dangers of encroaching to, hey, man, it's a win-win. And if you need to see any more evidence of how that's playing out right now is, I guess, about a week or two before that statement was made, you had Zelensky come into town to try and compel the U.S. Congress, especially the House and the Senate, to say, hey, we need a bunch of money. And so we're going to come in and do that. And of course, as you see here, these smiling people are all the titans of the defense industry. And this picture here is just so poignant because everyone looks so happy. They're talking about a war that's ravaging a country, and they look so happy to be sitting here trying to say, yeah, man, y'all pony up this money. But that just doesn't seem to be in line with what General Eisenhower warned about and where we are now.
There's there's so many elements of what you've said that are racing through my head. One of the first parts is that he set a great example when he retired. He did not go through the revolving door. He was one of those giants in the defense world that said, I don't want to use this experience to to further my financial interests. I think he went into academia. Is that right, Danny? I know that he didn't do what now we consistently see in former secretaries of defense and certainly the next level down almost always go straight into the defense industry. And one of the things that I found really astonishing was a study that we did a few years ago where we looked at former officers who go into defense contracting after they leave the military. And 90% of those people who did that become lobbyists for the industry. So it's not about, giving advice to the industry on strategy. It is about, taking advantage of who they know, not what they know.
Yeah, that's a great point, Danielle, because I think a lot of people think that, well, hey, of course they should be going into the industry because they're the ones who use the tanks and the planes, right? They're the ones who commanded the ships that the industry is building, and they know them best. And they know what the Navy or the Air Force and the Marine Corps, or the Army knows it best. But as you said, that's not what they do. They go in and they lobby, right? They're brought in because their friends still work at the Pentagon. One of the things that strikes me about listening to Eisenhower's comments is when the very beginning of what you played there, Danny, he says how we're confronted with something new. And that's really important for people to understand that before World War II, the United States did not have a permanent war industry. That prior to World War II, a lot of this had to do, of course, with industrialization. Prior to World War I, there weren't a lot of industrialized pieces of equipment that would allow for a permanent war industry to exist. After World War I, of course, that has changed with the aircraft, the tanks, the motorized vehicles, the different types of weaponry. But, certainly that doesn't become like a well-established part of the American economy
Indelible,
until the Second World War, where it becomes a private source of enormous profits. And so that's what Eisenhower is talking about there, because it is at that point in 1961, this is something that's only been around for about 15 years or so. And now we're at the point where you have both the Secretary of the State and Secretary of Defense, Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin, who came into their positions from the defense industry.
Straight in from it. Yeah. Not even hardly a revolving door at all. It just rolls straight in from one to the other. Now, I want to center our conversation today on a fresh piece of information that was in the New York Times a few days back. I know you've both seen it, and we're probably eager to talk a lot about it, but I want to set something up before we get into that, because something that Danielle said, actually heading into the 2016 elections, there was some people that were running around cutting some issue videos about some things that people need to watch about it. And Danielle, you said something very poignant at the end of this that I want to talk on just a second ago.
What you have is the companies giving huge campaign contributions to the people who make decisions in the Congress about whether their weapons are needed or not. And those people are also offering jobs to people coming in and out of the Pentagon and the military. So while you rarely see cases of actual law breaking, the problem is not that. It's that so much of this relationship is perfectly legal.
That's the key thing I wanted to focus in on. That a lot of the problem with the Pentagon is not that there's this underhanded stuff where, there's these secret handshakes that go on behind closed doors where some of these industry titans are saying, look, if you'll just vote this way on something in the Congress, or if you'll just say this here, we'll give you this big cash, whatever. It doesn't usually happen that way. I'm sure it does sometimes, but most of the ways it happens is legally, perfectly legal. That's why I want to bring in this New York Times piece here, because you can see, there's emblazoned right on the front cover. No one's hiding anything here. Is the former Secretary of Defense, Esper, who's very proud of his role in venture capitalism in the defense industry. And the one thing there are many things, but one of the big things that really stood out to me is a quote from this where it says the New York Times has identified at least 50 former Pentagon and national security officials, most of whom left the federal government in the last 5 years, who are now working in the defense-related venture capital or private equity as executives or advisors. In many cases, the Times confirmed that they continue to interact regularly with Pentagon officials or members of Congress to push for policy changes or increases in military spending that could benefit the firms that they have invested in. And look, we see that all the time. Like Jack Keane, whatever, is an easy one here because he always goes on Fox News and he's listed as a senior strategic advisor. That's what he's listed as. He's a defense contractor. So what advice do you think he's going to be given every time he goes on Fox News? And Danielle, I know that that's something that Pogo has been talking about for years. What in there stood out to you that you thought was noteworthy?
Well, the thing, Danny, that was particularly alarming about that story and the fact that we now have all these representatives of venture capital entering into the military-industrial complex is we have existing but inadequate protections around the revolving door, where there are some limits. For example, defense contractors, it is a certain number, I think it's about a dozen of their most highly paid positions. It is not considered an allowable cost to charge the government for above a certain salary. But in venture capital, that's not true. So you have a whole different universe of salaries that can be offered to former officials or military officers. And you also have in that story the people who were being interviewed from venture capital saying, well, I'm not a lobbyist, so I'm not registering. So all of those kinds of disclosures, weak as they are not applying to these companies because many of them also are still not even publicly traded companies. So you have even less transparency. So you have a whole new world of a lot more money, frankly, than the traditional defense contractors with less transparency. And it's just tremendously alarming.
And so no one's going to be doing anything to stop that gravy train, especially because the people who have the power to stop it are the ones who are going to benefit from it. So how fast do you think that's going to get reversed?
We did have a hearing this past year. I testified before Senate Armed Services on this issue. And it was a really, not surprisingly, it was chaired by Elizabeth Warren, who has really been a leader on concerns about the revolving door, particularly around the Pentagon. And there were some really good conversations about, for example, one of the senators said, but aren't there already a lot of rules around, even more than for other parts of the federal agencies that apply to DOD? And my answer was, don't you want that? Don't you want to have the highest levels of ethics when it comes to the mission of the DOD, to try to be ensuring that the people who are making national security decisions are basing those decisions on national security needs and not on their own financial interests? And that kind of got him to sit back, and he didn't have a good answer to that. So
well, and that kind of leads me into one of the other questions, Matt. I know that a lot of people say, well, it's not just the military-industrial complex, but it's the military-industrial congressional complex where there's a lot of the congressmen that are also involved with that. Now, I wonder if you could just touch on a little bit of what they mean when they say that.
And actually, that was the original phrase that Dwight Eisenhower had was military-industrial congressional complex. And the story is that it was stricken at the last moment because his speech writers and his policy advisors said, don't pick a fight with Congress right now. You still got a couple weeks left. We need to get a couple things through here at the end, and that's supposedly the story. It might be apocryphal that it was originally supposed to be military industrial congressional complex, but was stricken for political reasons. But certainly how it all works, the cycle of this, where the Congress appropriates money to the Pentagon, that money then goes to weapons contractors. Roughly half of the defense budget goes to the weapons contractors. So if you have a $900 billion defense budget this year, which is what we have, $886 billion, half of that is going to the arms contractors. And half of that goes to just the big five arm contractors. So 25% of that $900 billion is going to Raytheon, Lockheed, General Dynamics, Boeing, et cetera. Right. So, and that money then gets put through a variety of ways back into Congress and back into the public policy making spectrum. One of it is through campaign contributions, obviously. Another is through a media presence. Wherein, as you described, Danny, you have people like Jack Keane, who is a defense contractor, going on Fox News, but the Chiron, on the bottom, it describes him as a strategic how was it described as?
Strategic advisor, senior
Strategic advisor, right? Not defense contractor. Other ways too. These think tanks are funded through the defense industry, and the think tankers are the ones that go into Congress and advise Congress on policy. And oftentimes these think tanks are holding places for Republicans who are out of power or Democrats who are out of power, say like the Center for New American Security or the Institute for Study of War. So this is a holding place for policy people. And, then they go back into the government when their party takes power again. So there's a number of ways that this money is recycled. So the money gets appropriated, it goes to the Pentagon, it goes to the weapons contractors, and then it gets put back into a cycle, and it is extremely effective. One of the big things for these private venture capitalist private equity firms is always return on investment. And to give you an idea of how great the return on investment is on influencing Congress, over the 20-year span from 2001 to 2021, the weapons industry spent $1 billion in its lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. Over that time, they earned $7 trillion in contracts. So for a $1 billion investment, they received $7 trillion in weapons contracts.
Yeah, you can see why
I think that's such an important point, Danny. Matt, because many people think that it's really focused, the problem is really around campaign contributions, but that's actually a very small number in comparison to the amount of money that's spent on directly influencing, through meetings and having receptions and having those sort of interactions through lobbying. And also, as you talked about the institutions, the think tanks. The other part of the problem with think tanks getting so much defense contractor money is they're also funded by foreign governments. Right. Often those institutions are receiving big chunks of money from the very governments that are also trying to influence policy, to benefit themselves as well as the defense industry. So that's another part of that needs to be added to the mix. We need to add foreign governments.
The think tanks are also funded by the U.S. government as well. So the CIA, the State Department, the Pentagon, they fund think tanks as well. There's a big thing a number of years ago where New America Foundation were the supposed experts on our overseas drone campaigns, on our drone warfare. And it turns out New America was taking a couple $1 million from the State Department. So how come people want to know why they're wasn't so adversarial? Maybe it's because they had a couple $1 million coming in from the State Department.
Danielle, I want to ask you something. Back on the issue of what's legal and what's not, and what's bribery and what's not. There's something that always stood out to me, and really since about 2015, when I was really paying attention and digging into some of the details on this from opensecrets.org. They have some great information in there. I noticed that when you looked at, especially in the defense industry, who they are providing funds to, and of course, the whole issue you talked about with lobbying, that's an additional issue I want to touch on in a second. But when you look at who they support and who gets this money, so I can't remember which one it was at the time, but it was one of the House Armed Services Committee chairman would get in per cycle close to $500,000 in his campaign accounts, and the lower they went down in ranking, the money went down a little bit until the people who aren't in that industry, aren't in that committee, of course, get nothing. And so if you're giving $500,000 to somebody, and that's the guy that's in charge of making decisions on what gets funded and what doesn't, you don't have to come in with the said, hey, I'll give you a bunch of money if you'll vote this way. All I got to do is give you the money, and you're going to do that on your own. But it's so self-evident that that's a conflict of interest, isn't it?
Absolutely. It is absolutely. It should be illegal for members of Congress. Well, among the other conflicts that I want to get to on this. So not only do you have the chair of a committee, not just the Armed Services, but also the Defense Appropriations Committee, where you'll see they often get even more because they're the ones who actually set the budget. But when you have the Armed Services Committees, the reason why those chair are often getting so much money is because they're setting the agenda for what the conversation is even going to be about. They're the ones who are deciding what the hearings are going to be about. They're deciding who's going to testify. So that is so valuable to the industry to sort of essentially they're writing the script for what Congress is going to be talking about. And in addition to those elements of undue influence by industry and Congress, you have two more that I just want to raise. One is we consistently have military fellows in every single congressional office, but we have more in the committees of jurisdiction that are often actually paid by the industries or think tanks that are funded by the industries. And so they are working literally on congressional products and writing reports, even though they're not government paid employees. And you also have the additional problem of members of Congress are still able to invest in and trade in stock of those industries that they are overseeing. So then they have this very personal interest if they know that a big weapon system is about to, they're going to be getting briefings, classified briefings. So it's not public information about something that's about to be approved. And suddenly they're investing in the stock. And we see that happen. And we still have not been able to prevent that from.
And that's not illegal, or is it?
It is not illegal yet.
Yeah. And the only people that can make it illegal are the ones who benefit from it. So
that's right.
You can see how fast that's going to happen. Listen, I want to change course here for just a second, because I don't want people to get bogged down into thinking that this is only an issue of ethics and morals, all of which it is really. But there is a problem here that this is causing the United States, I believe, is that our very national security is actually diminished by this, I would argue. And more people are starting to recognize that too. We had David Sachs, who's one of the friends of our show, tweeted out a few months back that one of the craziest revelations of the Ukraine war is that the U.S. can't produce as much ammunition as Russia, even though U.S. spends over $800 billion then. Now it's almost $100 billion more, which is 10 times that of Russia. American taxpayers must be getting ripped off royally by the military-industrial complex. And look, that's a big issue here. We can't even make enough artillery shells for our own needs, for example, and definitely can't, keep up with what we're doing in Ukraine. And yet we have this massive spending bill that we have every year. And the question is, how is it that we can't even make enough stuff to keep I'm talking basics down? Then this one here in the Wall Street Journal, this is just a couple of days ago. The West badly needs more missiles, but it takes years to produce them. And already the stuff we've given away is going to take years. And so I'm asking you guys, how is it that when we spend close to $1 trillion, and I bet it won't be much longer until we actually hit that threshold, we're spending that much on defense, but yet we don't have the basics to run it. Of course, don't even get me started on, how little we pay some of our lower enlisted and the quality of life that they have and all that.
Housing.
Where's this money going, and why is our defense industry not taking up the tab?
I got the answer for you. A great example of exactly that describes why this is happening is the ongoing fight between the A-10 Warthog, which is a close air combat that has been aircraft that has been proven to save lives. It is an essential part of warfare, and all of the services continue to be trying to get rid of the A-10 because they want the F-35. Why do they want the F-35? Because industry makes so much more money from this new, vastly overcomplicated and underperforming alternative. And so when we pushed Congress to actually have a fly-off between the two aircraft, okay, let's just actually prove which one is going to be more effective, one that's much older and doesn't make as much money for industry anymore, or this new fancy shiny object. And they classified the results for years because it didn't prove the point they wanted to make. We've just been able to get the unclassified version that, of course, the A-10 outperformed the F-35. Wow. But that's an example where all of the decision policymakers around which of these aircraft should be investing and modernizing, they want to go for the more expensive, less valuable for national security version rather than the trusted and true one. That to me is a perfect example of why we put more money and get less security.
Yeah, and I can give you an example from my own life, my own experience. Because what Danielle described, that's the entire culture. Is this idea that it has to cost more. If it doesn't cost more, nobody wants it. And in 2008, I was leading a team at the Joint IED Defeat Organization, JIDO, and our job was to find technology that would spot suicide bombers. Right. So we partnered with an Air Force laboratory and we did all these tests. We had like 30 different types of cameras, X-ray machines, imaging devices, infrared, et cetera, et cetera. And we only had 2 that actually met our requirements. One of them was the big machines that you have in the airports that you can't put outside because rain will ruin them. And then the other was the $2,500 x-ray machine you have at every county courthouse in America. That was the only thing that met our requirements. And when I went in to brief the deputy, the SES who was second in command there at JIDO about these results, he said, yeah, this is great, good work, but it's never going to go anywhere. These machines don't cost enough. You know, if you came in here and said the solution was $350,000 machines, I would agree with you. But the fact that they're only $2,500 or $3,000, it's just not going to go anywhere. It just won't get
He
through.
said that out loud?
He was being honest and he was being sympathetic. He understood. But that's and getting back to the article that was referenced about the private equity firms. What you see in there is that greed, is that desire for profit taking. So you have people in that industry saying, our interest is not in long-term contracts. Our interest is in short-term funding. These people have no interest in what is actually good for the national security of the United States, what's a good investment for the Pentagon in terms of providing quality equipment, things that will meet the needs of the mission of the Pentagon. It's simply about getting these companies that they invested in an infusion of cash so that somebody else buys them, or so they can go public and sell shares so that they can get their money back and get their return on investment. So you see that short-term greed. And when I was reading this article of the Pentagon meeting with these venture capitalists, it reminded me of a quote from of Cornel West, the philosopher who's now running for president, who said, in the United States, we live at the intersection of might makes right and greed is good. And that's what you see there, right? This synergy, this synthesis that occurs. But, this idea is basically profit taking. How much can we make? And the reason why you can't produce enough 155 rounds is because there's no surge capacity, because that was not written into the contracts. Because the contracts for, say, 155 rounds were for those companies to make money first and foremost, and not for the United States to meet its defense needs. That's secondary.
I got to see if I can find it quickly. I got a note from David Sachs, actually, just before we went on here, where he sent me something that was very poignant and very much on the relevance to this, where he said it's not just 155 millimeter shells, but it's 155 millimeter shells, javelins, HIMARS, GMLRS, Stinger, all kinds of things that we need for regular warfighting are all on this lower end because they don't make a lot of money. To Danielle's point there. Now, I'm glad that we have people like David Sachs and both of you guys that are, waving some of the warning flags and saying there's an issue here. But I want to go back to something that Eisenhower said at the beginning of this, which I wanted to make sure included, where he said it's the citizenry that can bring pressure on the government to do the right thing. And it may sound like it's an impossible task, but I want to show you a very short clip of somebody who did try, who did get it right. And I know this fellow, both of you guys, I know he's very near and dear to your heart. He passed away not long ago. But Pierre Sprey, he did it right. And look what he accomplished.
At the time, a little group called the Whiz Kids that were supposed to look over the entire defense budget, find areas where we were spending too much or too little. I got asked to analyze the entire part of the U.S. defense budget that had to do with buying airplanes for a Cold War in Europe. It was a very exciting area to work in for a guy who had wanted to design airplanes. And came up with the conclusion that the Air Force was horrendously wasting money on deep strike bombing, totally useless thing that would never stop the Russians for anything more than days, and that we were underfunding real air-to-air, real air combat. And a huge storm arose out of that. We started a program to build a real, small, super hot, super cheap fighter that could whip any other fighter in the world. It has to be able to maneuver, accelerate, fire missiles, and out-dogfight another airplane. That became the F-16. Even though an Air Force general had once told me, you'll never see that little son of a bitch fly. We built over 4,500 of them, and they're still in production.
That last part reminded me there, Matt, of what you were just telling me about that one guy said, well, it's not expensive enough. We need these expensive bombers over here. But so I'll just ask you, I mean, I did have the pleasure of meeting Pierre Sprey earlier in my, or later in my career, and was just amazed by his tenacity and his incredible perseverance and knowledge. But the question is, was he the last of his breed? Are there any people, do you think, that can still hold the Pentagon accountable and change things?
I can't. I mean, honestly, having the pleasure of knowing Pierre for most of my adult life, there is not going to be another person like him. So I can't say that's going to be possible. I'd also note he was also the father of the A-10 that I was talking about as well. But that doesn't mean to say that us mere mortals can't make a difference just because we can't be as brilliant as Pierre. And I do think the point you're making, Danny, is really important. Is I think the danger that I always worry about in talking about these problems is making people feel, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And that's just simply not true. Time after time, we see when we explain to constituents, this is what's happening, and they talk to their members of Congress, maybe not the chair of the committee, because they're really already essentially bought and paid for.
Gone to the dark side?
But there's a whole lot of other people who can really make a difference in the Congress who aren't necessarily, thinking about how important this is. And those are the people I think we should all be spending a lot of time talking to. They get a vote. Sometimes they're chairs of other committees, and they can start influencing policy in a way that would really help us advance security.
Right. Danielle's absolutely right. And the proof of that is the fact that if all it was campaign contributions, that's all they had to do was just, participate, conduct this legalized bribery, which is what it is. That's all they would do. Right. Because again, they're about maximizing profits. And the way you maximize profits is you reduce your expenses, you cut your costs. But that's not enough. That's not enough just to give these guys campaign contributions. And that's why they have their people all throughout the media, so that whenever a member of Congress or their staff opens the Washington Post or turns on CNN, the quotes are coming from people that are funded by the defense industry. Same thing, too. That's why they have all these lobbyists. That's why they have these think tanks that are holding pens for out of work, out of power officials, or for, who could then go in and influence policy. That's why, as Danielle described, they fund all these fellows, right? So what it really comes down to is that, yes, talking to people really matters. And you see this when you talk to members of Congress, and a lot of times you'll come in there to represent a viewpoint, and they may say, this is the first time I've heard this.
Yeah.
This is right. I mean, and getting access and everything, okay, that's an issue, but you work with organizations that are established. But if you can get in there and talk to them, and you come back and be persistent. I mean, you've seen this over and over again with whatever it is when you're on the Hill. You see these industry groups in there, because this is not an issue. This legalized bribery is not an issue only confined to the military industrial complex. Yeah. This is for everything, for agriculture, pharmaceuticals, whatever it is. This is the reality of a system that's bought by money. But if you go in there and you talk to them, you are doing a significant disservice to the military industrial complex, because they are very concerned with that. And that's why they staff, and that's why they fund, and that's why they supply all these various other measures to try and make sure that their interests are what Congress does.
Danielle, I know you guys do a lot of grassroots stuff. For any of our audience who's watching here that feels a lot of the frustration that we do, but wants to do something, what can you offer them? Anything they can do, whether it's through Pogo or elsewhere?
Well, absolutely. I'd love them to. They can sign up through pogo.org to learn how to get involved, and we are establishing programs that will help train people on how to meet with, and we can set up meetings with members of Congress in district and start giving them talking points. And we're really seeing how it can make a difference in numerous places along the path towards policy change. So I think it's really exciting for people who care about this. And that's the thing that's also important. People, once they understand this, they really care about this. And I encourage them to come and we'll work with them.
Well, we will definitely encourage them to do that, because I just can't tell you how much this is important. Now, Matt, I know that you're right there with me as a combat vet. that we need to make sure that we have a strong national defense. There's a reason why we have it in case we're ever, Pearl Harbor style attacked or whatever. We need to keep our country straight, but we also have to do it in a wise way, because right now we're not doing it in a wise way, folks. And I encourage you to go to pogo.org, do the things that Danielle talked about. She'll actually help, educate you on how you can actually do something and to make a difference. Yeah, that's great. You're helping the country and it's fun, which is it's a big benefit. But I'm telling you, this is much more important than you think. I mean, the whole F-35 is a big issue. I know that I looked at some of the data a couple of years back, and we're already going into production in some areas, and they haven't even done the operational testing fully. That's just blows my mind that any industry in America would be allowed to go that far with that much funding and not even know for sure if it's going to perform. Danielle, you pointed out it's underperforming already.
Right.
So we need to get this stuff fixed so that we only put good stuff like Pierre sprays planes in the air. And I remember he had some ideas about how we could have done better than the F-35. It's much cheaper. And if we ever go to war, folks, we're going to need that good stuff.
That's right. That's exactly right. There are very good people who are in the system. They're just saying me looking for another Pierre, he was just really one of them.
Okay, maybe that's a little too high, but there's a bunch of us together. There's strength in numbers.
That's right.
So let's start getting
We
together.
can be that big fish with all the little fish, make a big fish.
Exactly. That's what America's all about. We're famous for doing that. Well, listen, folks, I sure appreciate you both coming on. It's been a pleasure to have you on here, and look forward to having you on again. And again, that's pogo.org. If you want to do something, they would be loving to have you come over there and help them out.
We would love it. Thank you.
We hope that they do, and I hope that you guys do. Matt, thanks again for coming on. We look forward to having you, as we always do, and we'll see you next week. And that's all we have for you today on this episode. We'll be back again live tomorrow, talking with Professor Bartov. We're going to be looking back at the Middle East issue there. You won't want to miss that one. Thank you for coming. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the information you need to make sense of your life. And we will see you on the next episode of Deep Dive.